Good evening. My name is Harold Knudsen. I'm the author of Fisher Ames, Christian Founding Father and Federalist, framer of religious freedom and the greatest orator of the early republic. This was published this year in 2025. It has took me 10 years to research and write. It has over 1,300 footnotes, mostly primary source notes, 82 illustrations, many not seen before in any other publication. Here is the agenda of what I will touch on in this presentation. I cannot obviously cover the entire book in an hour or so, but I will try to cover the key pillars of what I think are important for a time period of this length. Two of the primary sources used in this work are the Annals of the Congress, which is the set is there to the left. The ones that have been checked in white are the ones when Fisher Ames was in office. He was there from March of 1789 and left office in early 1797. Um, Another one after that I did still use as he was paying attention to the workings and the goings on in the Congress. The other one is the Works of Fisher Ames, published by his son in 1854. This is a collection, the largest collection of his letters and most of the essays that he wrote and some of the speeches in his time, although there would be some supplements later. But this is the largest collection of single source collection of where his writings are found. Of those letters, these are the depositories of the most of them and some of his papers. The largest collection is at the Dedham Historical Society in Dedham, Massachusetts. 254 letters there. The next one is the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston, Massachusetts. And the other locations that I have listed here have may only have one or three or a few dozen. But these are the primary places where what is left of his writings can be found. This one on the left here is a picture I took of one at the Historical Society in Boston. It's from 1807. Gives you a good idea of what his handwriting looked like. Um, the although the letter there that I just showed you did not have a more typical autograph of his, this is more typical of his signature on this periodical called Bone to Gnaw. Another source that I used that I got to know was Mr. Alden Ames, who goes by Tripp. He is a descendant of Fisher Ames, and he has a collection of some of his possessions, such as his desk you see there in the upper left-hand corner, a grandfather clock, a letter there signed by George Washington. He has one of the Gilbert Stuart paintings of his ancestor that we are standing next to in these pictures, and an example of one of the certificates that Fisher Ames got. Here's a close-up of another one where he is inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And what's interesting about this one is John Adams was the president at the time. That's his signature there, bottom right. Um, I told you about his son, Seth Ames, and this is probably the only photograph of him that exists there in the center. His Seth Ames's son, Fisher Ames's grandson, Pelham, there to the right, put together a homemade book that he called Genealogical Notes in around 1900, which I got to use in the research from Mr. Ames today, um, which has some photographs and some other things in there that cannot be found anywhere else. And here are two very interesting photographs. This is Pelham Ames's house there on the left that was destroyed in the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. They lived there, obviously, And to the right is a rental house they had to move into after that. He and Mrs. Ames sitting there in the parlor or living room. You see that Gilbert Stuart painting up above Mrs. Ames's head there. So I'm going to start with some very early ancestry to give you an idea of his background, heritage-wise. Um, and the Ameses came originally from the Normandy region of France, and they took their name from the French city of Amiens, and their name at the time was Amiens. Now, being they were Normans, being Normans meant that they were earlier than that. They had actually been Danish Vikings who had come over several hundred years earlier when they conquered northern France. But as the centuries went by, they assimilated and learned to speak French and became essentially French. At one point in the 1000s, the Duke William of Normandy had claimed that the King of Denmark, which also owned and ruled England, or much of it, had promised him the crown of England. But apparently, a Viking by the name of Harald Hardrada had also claimed that he was promised by the King of Denmark that he would rule over England. And so this war occurred between these two. You'll see listed some of the major events and battles, but the most important one was the Battle of Hastings, where the Duke William of Normandy, otherwise known as William the Conqueror after this, had defeated Hardrada and he became the King of Denmark. So the Ameses, or the Amiens, went over with him in 1066 to be part of this campaign. Um, and they come up on records 200 years later as living near a town called Bruton, England, which you see here in the bottom right. And the town where they actually were was called Wake Campflower. I'll show you that on the next slide. However, this is the oldest piece of research I came into doing this work. This is a manumissions document where two of the Ameses at this time, or Amies as they were called in this century, the 1400s and the latter Middle Ages, were granted their freedom from serfdom. It's a manumissions document. The first line up top was an AD 1478. It was granted by John Fitzjames, Lord of Wake Campflower, and says to William Ames, son of John Ames of Wake, Erfurt, his William with his sequels. And then a couple of years later, the second entry in the bottom, in AD 1483, another manumission was granted to Roger Ames and William Ames, who were the sons of John Ames, granted by Joan, the wife of John Fitzjames, Esquire, who was the lady of Wake Campflower, assuming that her husband had since passed. So this is from the Somerset Records um, depository over there in Somerset, England. I showed you the picture of Bruton, England, so you can see on the map where that is in southwestern England, and then the map above in the middle shows you where Wyke Campflower is. It's really a hamlet, and that picture of it is as it is today. So I suppose it's not much larger than it was in the 1400s or 1500s. The stained glass there to the right is a was one that was put in the purchased and put in the Bruton Cathedral by Pelham Ames in around 1900. He went over there to learn about his ancestors, and he paid for this stained glass and put it in there. So I assume it's still in that particular cathedral that I showed you on the previous slide. So after the 1400s, as we get into the 1500s, you have several generations. John Ames first, second, and third, and he has a third child, William, born in 1604, and a fourth, John IV in 1610. Now, both of these sons were dissenters of the crown at the time, and they were told, all dissenters were told by the king, who was not going to put up with dissension over how he decreed Church of England would be, that they either get on board or they have to leave. He said that he would harry them out of the land. He would harry all the dissenters out of the land, and that's what he did. And so John first went to the New World to seek religious freedom in 1635, and that stained glass window is a memorial to their leaving England to go to the New World for religious freedom. Now, John returned to England presumably and brought William over in 1638. That's what records of the ships portend. So William comes over 3 years after John. He has a son who he calls John, and he became known as a well-known Indian fighter in Massachusetts during what was known as King Philip's War, where you have a drawing of this particular Indian there on the right. And Nathaniel Ames' son is born in 1677. He's known as a militia captain, not much else known about him. And then there's Nathaniel II, born in 1708. He would become Fisher Ames's father, and he was known as a Dr. Ames. Now, obviously, there were no medical schools or colleges in the New World at this time, so people who fancied themselves as doctors just gave themselves the title. But what what Nathaniel did do was publish almanacs. His first one in 1726. And these kinds of almanacs, being a self-proclaimed doctor, professed all kinds of living healthy ideas and recipes and all kinds of things that a self-professed doctor would want to tell people about. And these were contemporary to Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard almanacs. And for a while, not only did they run longer, I should say, than Franklin's ones, but they were actually more popular than his in their time. So then, the Ames has moved to Dedham, Massachusetts. This is a painting of Dedham in 1790. And this one, the original is in Rockland, Maine, and the copy is in the Dedham Historical Society in Dedham, Massachusetts. And this gives you an idea of what the town looked like where the Ameses lived by the late 18th century. Here's another drawing of this period. Now, the drawing was done in 1890, but it's supposed to be of the Ameses Inn in the latter 18th century. Now, Nathaniel, he didn't build it. He married a girl named Mary Fisher in 1735. She was the daughter of a tavern owner who owned this particular tavern, and they took the inn over um, once they were married from her father. But she died just 2 years later in 1737. Dr. Ames would remarry another woman named Fisher in 1740, first named Deborah, and she was the daughter of a farmer. They had 5 children together, and the last one was Fisher Ames. He was born on April 9, 1758. So Nathaniel continued his father's almanacs. He ran the inn with his wife and became active in the Sons of Liberty, and he would allow them to meet there since they had space in the dining area. But unfortunately, Nathaniel died in 1764 when Fisher Ames was only 6 years old. Now, the Ameses were very pious Christians, and their denomination was Calvinists. And as I say in my book, Christianity for these denominations was really not just a thing of reforms and decencies or Sunday church attendance and for appearances. It was really a pervading principle in all of their lives. It was expressed in all their concerns, thoughts, hopes, everything. As Calvin wrote here, the namesake for their denomination. For anyone to arrive at God, the Creator, he needs Scripture as his guide and teacher. So obviously it was pervasive, but not only for the Calvinists, for all Christian peoples in the New World, it was the same for them. It was in everything. in their manner of speaking, in the legal documents, in the media, the money, the treaties, the public square, everywhere. Um, the one in the picture in the upper top left, I took at the Massachusetts Historical Society. This is a real estate deed, and this is a typical heading of a real estate deed to all Christian people. And you see the bottom left is a printed note, shillings and 8 pence from the colony of North Carolina, and it has the Holy Bible showing on the lower left-hand corner. To the right is a copy of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and its heading is "In the name of the most holy undivided Trinity." Last example here, but there are many and they're endless, is this public cross there in town, right next to Bunker Hill. Um, and this drawing was done in 1825, some decades after the War of Independence, but it shows you that Christianity pervaded throughout early American society as well, not just colonial society, both. So for Ames, um, obviously he was taught from as soon as he could understand anything Christianity. But other things, he was obviously also went to public school, and he was tutored in addition to by a local educator. And his parents, even before his father Nathaniel died, when Ames was 6, they seemed to think that he had, a high intelligence quotient, capacity to learn and do well. So they wanted to just get him off to college when the time came. And he was accepted to Harvard in 1770 at the age of 12 for the graduating class of 1774. Harvard also was a Christian college, like all the other colleges in the colonial period, and they had rigid prayer times, church attendance, and all sorts of rules. But outside of Christianity, Ames also took courses in Greek and Latin, the ancient civilizations, which he loved, philosophy, rhetoric and debate, which he loved, mathematics, European history, and certainly many other things. Ames was particularly fond of Roman history. You'll see that throughout his later essays in life. But while at college, he joined several debate clubs. Here are some of the names of them: the Institute and the Mercurian Club, and one that he helped found was the one in the middle there, the Improvement and Eloquence Club. And many people thought that Ames was quite eloquent, so that theme also comes up in the history of Fisher Ames. So his junior year in 1773, the Boston Tea Party had occurred, and it became quite obvious that, at least in Massachusetts and to some degree in the other colonies, that they were starting to drift away and rebel from the mother country. So with Ames's graduation in 1774 in his Bachelor of Arts, he starts out first teaching in Dedham as the war is certainly looming. And that year came the passage of the Coercive Acts, which added more fuel to the fire, such as these here: the Boston Port Act, Massachusetts Government Act, the Administration of Justice Act, Quartering Act, and the elimination of the colonial governor and replacing him with essentially a military governor, which quite helped to inflame the situation even more. April next year, in 1775, the war began. Um, Loyalists had tipped off the British authorities that some colonists, these Sons of Liberty people, were hiding arms in Lexington and Concord, and so the British sent out a battalion to these two towns to go and confiscate them, and if necessary, confront and arrest whoever they needed to. When there was a call up, Ames joined the second one, which was a 122-man militia muster in Dedham, and this was just 2 weeks after his 17th birthday, so he was quite young. They marched quote here, they marched to Boston upon the alarm of the Bunker Hill fight in June. Now, Fisher Ames did not fight himself at Bunker Hill, but he mans the siege lines a few days later after the battle. But of his company from Dedham, 17 men fought at Bunker Hill. After the colonials in Massachusetts had essentially chased the English battalion and its reinforcements back into Boston, uh, confining it there, the siege of Boston occurs. And this drags on until March of 1776. So Ames is part of the manning of these various lines and forts for a period of time. 1776, the now the Patriots, if you want to call them that, they write the Declaration of Independence, which calls for independent and sovereign states. This is sent to King George. Of course, he doesn't like this at all, and the war is on, and it's also a low point for the colonials. Certainly, the uh, the siege of Boston went well. They had 20,000 militiamen showed up for that, and George Washington arrived to take charge of it. And so they had more than overwhelming numbers to do the job there. But the British then left for a while. They extricated the forces they had there in Boston and went to Nova Scotia, and then they were reinforced with both army and strong navy presence, and they returned this time to Washington to New York to attack Washington, who has no real chance against these numbers, and he retreats into New Jersey. But Washington, he meets his low point, but then of course he's inspired and to take on the resurgence with a surprise victory at Trenton and a good performance at Germantown. Also, British General de Burgoyne is defeated in 1777, not by Washington, but one of the other colonial generals, and General Howe asks to be replaced. So the British are failing in their campaign in the mid-Atlantic area. Fisher Ames, at this time, he's been teaching in the local schools when he was no longer on the siege lines in Boston. And of note, there wouldn't be any more fighting in the Boston area during the war. It was where it started, but there would only be some smaller events, military events in the main district, but not in and around Boston. So Ames is earning his keep, helping his mother, but he's also teaching at local schools um, to earn some money, and he also has to help her, help repay her for the cost of his Harvard education. In 1777, um, the Ames family has two tragedies. One of Fisher Ames's older brothers, Seth, comes home from the war with tuberculosis. He had been out in the Roxbury lines in the Continental Army. He was a medic, and he contracted this disease. He was sent home in December of 1777. Ames and his siblings and his mother tried to take care of him as best they could, but he succumbed and he died on New Year's Day in 1778. Another older brother named William was lost at sea in 1777, and nothing was known about his disappearance. Nobody ever came by the house to say they knew him on a ship or anything like that. So there's absolutely no information as to what happened to his brother William. So these were two tragedies that the family had to deal with in 1777. The next year, Ames starts studying law, what is known at the time they called it reading the law, and he studies under a prominent young Boston attorney named William Tudor. And you see his picture there to the left. And he will study the law from 1778 to 1781. Mr. Tudor had very high standards. He studied and clerked under John Adams, who, when Adams was in practice, was a leading attorney in the state. And of note, he's the one who defended the British soldiers who were accused of murder at the Boston Massacre. He got their acquittal. So certainly John Adams was a principled man who didn't care what people thought if he knew and thought he was right on whatever the issue might be. So I'm certain that Mr. Tudor was of the same stamp that Adams was. So Ames is mustered in again in 1778 to go to the Roxbury lines to man those, and also the Roxbury Fort. These were, of course, erected in 1775. And I did find in research in a book from 1850 some drawings of these that show their state of preservation in 1850. Now the pictures are not particularly sharp, but you could still get an idea of what these diggings looked like. I imagine they lasted then well into past the Civil War, I suppose, until urban development claimed them finally. So the British then were also changing their campaigning strategy in North America. As I said, they had been stymied in the Mid-Atlantic by General Washington, and they decided that they would campaign in the South, starting with the seizure of Savannah, Georgia, also in 1778, in December of that year. And their plan was to try and leverage what they thought was greater loyalism there, a larger population of loyalists in the South as compared to the Mid-Atlantic and certainly in New England. So the British take Charleston then in 1780 also, and they defeat General Gates at the Battle of Camden. So for a little while, the British Southern strategy seems to be working, but ultimately it's going to fail. The Southerners step away from the traditional method of warfare, and they change the complexion of the war down there to guerrilla warfare by raising partisan groups. And this ultimately frustrates the British. And they ultimately decide they're going to have to leave and leave the South as well. There are American victories then at Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse. These, of course, are again a little more traditional in their execution, following the successful guerrilla warfare campaigns against the British. And after those defeats, the British withdraw to Charleston, South Carolina, and their plan from there is to march north to Yorktown, Virginia in 1781, where they would then be extricated by the British fleet and taken to New York to join with their other army up there, and then decide, well, how to proceed in this war. But that never happens. They are trapped at Yorktown by the French fleet. The British fleet can't get in to the York River. They lose the Battle of the Capes right there at the mouth of what's called Cape Henry in Virginia. And so they're trapped and they endure this siege by Washington, joined by French General Rochambeau, and they surrender. So this entire British army is removed from the chessboard of the war, and this is the major turning point in the war. 1781, while this is going on, Ames becomes a full-fledged lawyer up in Dedham / Boston area. This year, the members of the Bar Association, they met with Tudor at his office to discuss Fisher Ames's progress and to see if he was indeed ready to become a lawyer. And they decide that he is ready to take the bar exam and move on to start his career and that he's finished just reading the law, as they called it at the time. So Fisher Ames passes the bar exam and he's sworn in as a lawyer in October of 1781. And he sets up his own law practice in Dedham in 1781. And by the spring of the next year, in 1782, he has many clients and he's starting to earn a living as an attorney, as a lawyer. Now, just before the end of the War of Independence. In 1780, the uh, the colonies, become, they call themselves states, but they start to consider themselves a confederacy of of several states. Um, and then in 1783, they write this governing document called the Articles of Confederation. So now it's very limited. The states are essentially just a military alliance. Um, there's only They only have their Continental Congress, which changes names a few times, and it only meets on occasion. There's no president. Um, there isn't the more extensive government that we would have later. There's no currency, and this causes stagnant economy. And they also have a war debt of 80 million um, by 1783 when the war is over. In 1785, Congress made a final attempt to raise revenue by an amendment to the Articles of Confederation by levying a tax on imports, but this fails. And another problem that arises is the states started to raise protective tariffs against each other and duties and excises, causing a number of small, almost economic wars against each other. And this contributes to stagnating further the economy of these states. One quote here I have is from the French minister to the United States at the time. He says, "There's no general government in America. There's no head, meaning that there's nobody that can clear this up and get things moving in the right direction." So it becomes quite clear that there is a need for some measure of centralized regulations of the commerce, at least, and that's quite apparent. Alexander Hamilton as one of the leading voices, if not the leading voice at this time period, who calls for he says, the wisdom of all the members of the Confederacy to amend and fix the defects of the Articles of Confederation. And he writes a good number of the Federalist Papers to expose the weaknesses of the Confederacy. And the other writers were James Madison and John Jay. So they write those throughout the early and mid 1780s. So the new and fledgling United States is going sideways with regards to a its commerce and its economy, which seems to be failing. But there is a catalyst that comes along that's going to change all this, and this is Shays' Rebellion in Western Massachusetts in 1786. This was an incident where many of these veteran farmers found themselves getting in more and more financial trouble, and because of the all of these problems that have been cited, due to a lack of a head and a federal government to do some of these things, but also because the legal system came after them. These farmers borrowed money from the people on the coasts who had it, and then at some point they're asked to pay it back, and they don't have it. They'd never been paid for their service in the war, and so there are, you know, um, writs, lawsuits against them. Tax collectors come after them, foreclosures, and all kinds of problems. And this bubbles to the surface and becomes a rebellion of sorts. And they go after all these people, like they go after tax collectors and other people that represent the legal system in essentially open rebellion. So this is where Fisher Ames starts to form his political thought. He is certainly on the side of the state, and he is worried that property rights and the rule of law were in danger of mob rule, who we saw in Daniel Shay, and his fellow farmers who were resorting to violence and rioting and other sorts of things. And he writes his first essay under the pen name Lucius Janius Brutus. He says here, to rouse the torpid patriotism of men who have everything to lose by the subversion of an excellent constitution. further says, in a free government, the reality of grievance is no kind of justification for rebellion. Now, you might think that, well, now, didn't the colonists just do the same exact thing that they fought for, to break away from them, to secede from the mother country? Well, it is true, but what Ames is saying here is that you have we have an excellent government which gives you representation. So the difference here, and Washington would also say the same thing in other types of statements, the difference between Shays' rebellion and the rebellion that was all of the colonies against the mother country is that really over representation. There was no representation in the parliament. There was not one single member of parliament that represented and voted for any of the 13 colonies. But here in Massachusetts, these men, they may have grievances and probably legitimate ones, but they still have their representatives that they have to work through, and according to Fisher Ames. So, anyways, Fisher Ames is his thinking is shaped initially by Shays' rebellion towards what would become known as federalism. Here's a picture of Daniel Shay and his men who were finally defeated. They're apprehended in Springfield, Massachusetts, when they were trying to take over the armory and get more arms. This, of course, as I said, would be the catalyst that would get enough of the leaders to move toward a constitutional convention. A lot of this was led initially by Alexander Hamilton, who's a key proponent of it. After a compromise to finally agree upon a number of things before they would strike upon this largely what would be known as a Federalist Constitution, they would finally move that way. And this one would articulate no real political philosophy. It was only a framework for the new government and some of the civil rights that would go into that document. So enough of the states agreed to it, passed it, and they handed it on to the states the next year in 1788. And Ames was in full support of this. He was happy that this was happening. He writes more essays about the limitations of Confederacy, and that the right thing to do was move toward a federal union as outlined in this document. Because he became conspicuous in his opinions about this, Dedham elected Ames as a representative to convention at the state, and so for the Federalists. And so the person that he comes to debate the most is Samuel Adams, who's a leading anti-federalist at the time. And they spar quite a bit in 1788. And Ames comes out on top. He's much more eloquent, better with the English language, and he quiets Sam Adams after a while and answers all of his questions. And Adams becomes reticent, almost saying nothing toward the end, which he gets a lot of criticism for in the anti-federalist papers. So Ames carries the day for the Federalists, and they vote for ratifying, and Massachusetts votes for ratifying this thing. And one of note, Fisher Ames, this young man, uh, essentially is the one who carries the day for the Federalists in this state, and it was this state that for a while was holding it up. James Madison down in Virginia has made comment that at one point it's not looking like this is going to pass because it's hung up in Massachusetts, and Ames won the day. So he doesn't get much credit for that in the history books, but he should. Uh, Without him, it may not have passed. And if it didn't pass in Massachusetts, it would have never passed at all. We would have remained under the Articles of Confederation, at least probably for a long time. So the Federalists win adoption of the U.S. Constitution, and they compromise with the Anti-Federalists who wanted a Bill of Rights. To get their votes, they countered with the need, in their view, that that this that this Constitution doesn't have enough civil rights. It doesn't protect the states enough. So they want more things in it that do those things. And the Federalists agreed, and that was one of the main compromises. So that in exchange for that, the anti-Federalists then voted in enough numbers for the Bill of Rights and it passed. Because of Fisher Ames's outstanding work there, the Suffolk County Federalists endorsed and ran him uh, to uh, to become a representative in the new United States Congress that would seat next year in 1789. And he ran against Sam Adams, who would be on the other side, the candidate for the Anti-Federalists. And Ames defeats him quite handily. Now, one of the interesting quotes that he has here when he first arrives in Congress in New York in 1789 was an articulation of what the reason was for our Constitution. And I can say that I remember from my own grade school teachers talking about the need for getting the commerce going. And that was the simplistic explanation for it. That has stuck with me all my life. And I wonder if it was Ames that articulated this the best in his time. He says in this comment here, the present Constitution was dictated by commercial necessity more than any other cause. The want of an efficient government to secure the manufacturing interests and to advance our commerce was long seen by men of judgment and pointed out by patriots solicitous to promote the general welfare. So in New York, they start creating the new government. It's seated there in March of 1789, but they don't achieve a quorum until April the 1st. It takes a while for all of the members to trickle in. And one of the things, one of the assignments that Ames gets right away is he's appointed to the committee for the inauguration of President Washington. And he's very happy about this. He's very excited to be part of this. And he has several observations in his letters that are quite interesting. And some of these are I think, well known by some historians. Here's one of when he first saw him. He says, when I first saw Washington, I felt strong emotions. I believe that no man had ever so fair a claim to veneration as he. Ames also observed that time has made havoc upon his face. So after they did the inaugural ceremony, then all went over to St. Paul's Church, and Ames was had the privilege to sit with President Washington and Vice President Adams in the pew earmarked for him. And this is a drawing that depicts what that probably might have looked like. So I'm going to move forward into the summer of 1789. I'll just say that from April to June, they uh, they had a lot of work to do. Obviously, they had to, after inaugurating President Washington, they also had to sort of flesh out the executive branch, give him a staff and and department heads. So all of that they did. They also worked on the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, and whatever kind of staff they would need. And these are no small things. But they did all of these things plus pass some bills for revenue, for tariff bills, excise bills, so they could run the government, that they could pay for their hotels, they could pay for their salaries and whatever staff they brought on, according to the laws, the bills that they passed that were signed into law by President Washington. So there were quite a bit that they did in just a few short months to stand up a whole new government. Uh, but it was on June the 8th, James Madison comes in, and he he brought with him all of the copies of all of the state's um, ratification documents for the Constitution. There weren't, there were at least 9 of them. They didn't get all 13. I don't think it's till 1791 that Vermont is the last one to do it, but they needed 9, so they had 9 by 1788 and 1789. And he brings in, some of the states had sent along suggestions for what sorts of things needed to go into a Bill of Rights to protect civil rights of people and protect the rights of the states. And also other ideas, some of them simply newspaper editorials that he brought in. And they began work on the civil rights. James Madison said that they should work as a group on all of these, put all of our minds together on checking all of these to make sure they're correct and they get to all of the things that we need to. So now, when I started writing and researching initially, I didn't know what Ames's contribution was. I wouldn't find that out until I did my research and writing. My research that out to August of 1789. So Ames is the one who's going to come up with the right words, frame the words for what are often termed today as the religious clauses. But the start point was June the 8th, and James Madison had a suggestion. So the first suggestion is this one here. The civil rights of none shall be infringed, abridged on account of religious belief or worship, nor shall any national religion be established, nor shall the full and equal rights of conscience be in any matter or on any pretext infringed. A couple of weeks later, John Vining has a shortened suggestion. No religion shall be established by law, nor shall the equal rights of conscience be infringed. August the 15th, Elbridge Gerry shortens it even more. No religious doctrine shall be established by law. And on that same day, another member, Samuel Livermore, suggests Congress shall make no law touching religion or infringing the rights of Congress. So Ames is present for all of these and certainly part of the discussions as well. But he knows what they're trying to get to. He just doesn't think they've they've got their arms and their minds around it exactly. And he comes up with this, and on August the 20th suggests motions uh, with his version, which is Congress shall make no law establishing religion or to prevent the free exercise thereof. And he adds a third clause, or to infringe the rights of conscience. This is what all the members of the House of Representatives wanted to get to, and they liked it immediately. And they were all in favor of this. And this would become what they would hand off to the Senate when they were done with their version of the Bill of Rights, which of course was 10 amendments. But this is the one that Ames made a significant suggestion, contribution to, that would go over to the Senate. So when they're done, this is what goes over. So this is on the right page here is one of the Senate copies, one of their drafts. So it goes over to them on the 24th of August, which, as I said, the House proposals did. And then they started, they made changes, of course, to all the other amendments too. But with regards to what are they going to do about Christianity, these were the suggestions that various senators made later in August and also September. So here, first one, Congress shall not make any law infringing the rights of worship or establishing any religious sect or society. Another suggestion, Congress shall make no law establishing any particular denomination of religion in preference to another. September the 9th, another revision, Congress shall make no law establishing articles of faith or a mode of worship or prohibiting the free exercise of religion. And then on September the 25th, they decide, no, we're going to go back to what Fisher Ames over in the House of Representatives basically said. Back to Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting a free exercise thereof. So the only changes were changing Ames's word preventing to prohibiting, and then they dropped the third um, clause that Ames had about conscience, which will be, you'll see in the rest of this amendment along the lines of freedom of speech and press and right of people to assemble peaceably, petition, and so on and so forth. But two of the main parts of Ames's suggestion remain, and so the House and the Senate are behind him. And of course, this is what we have today. So now, as an aside, here are some of the myths and truths about the clauses, what we often call the clauses. Myths. One of the biggest myths that is out there today is this claim that the founders wanted a separation of church and state, and that separation of church and state is what these clauses mean. Another one is that Roger Williams was an influence, being the theologian from the previous century in Rhode Island. Another one is that Fisher Ames and James Madison had made some kind of compromise, ostensibly that Ames wanted a state church because he came from a state with a state church, Massachusetts, which was a Congregationalist denomination, and Madison, was from a state which was Virginia, which had abolished the state church tax, and which meant therefore they really don't have a state church, and that Ames was trying to make sure that the anti-federalists were not trying to get into their state's business about this. But that's one thought. And then another myth is that the Virginia Bill of Rights, which does this, which abolishes the church tax in Virginia, was the basis for the First Amendment. So here are the truths about these four myths. There's absolutely no mention of separation, separation of any kind, certainly not a separation of church and state in the annals of the Congress, meaning any of the debates and discussions that they had in the, on the floor of the House of the Representatives or in the Senate, and what the Senate finally agreed upon when they had their chance to work on it. There isn't any in any of the letters of Fisher Ames or any of the other contemporaries, fellow members of Congress whose letters I read and other sources that I read in the research to write this work. So that is not at all what they were talking about, this modern idea of a separation of church and state. What they were trying to do was get to an arrangement where there was a neutrality among all of the Christian denominations, and one would not be elevated over another, so there wouldn't be a national church, a Church of America, as it were. Also, nobody talked about Roger Williams. Not in the annal. You don't find that in the annal. You don't find him mentioned in the annals of the Congress. I'm not aware of any compromise between Ames and Madison about a church, state church or church tax. You know, Madison knew that what goes on in Massachusetts is none of his business, just like people in Virginia wouldn't want people in Massachusetts meddling in Virginia's affairs. So you don't see any of that. Ames's choice of word establishing, now that's found in the last clause of the last sentence of Article 3 of the Massachusetts Constitution. It's possible he took the word establishing from his own state's constitution. That would be logical. But what Ames really did, as I said, was framed a prohibition on Congress creating a national church after he distilled all the suggestions in the House in 1789. He made it so that the Congress could not pass a bill if they wanted to try and pick one of the denominations of Christianity and make it the national church or the Church of America. That is what this does, plus guarantee religious freedom. So a month later, Ames writes an article into a periodical called the Mercury in New England and Palladium, and he says this about the Bible: should not the Bible regain the place it once had as a school book? Its morals are pure, its example captivating and noble. In no book is there so good English. Now, no way would a person who believes in this modern idea of a separation of church and state say something like this. He would say this would not be allowed. So this is another piece of evidence that proves that this idea of separation is nothing that they talked about, and it certainly was not in his mind, and the records prove it wasn't in anybody else's mind in the early republic. All right, back onto the regular business of the Congress and moving forward into 90, Ames becomes a major proponent and fights hard for for Alexander Hamilton's financial plan. Uh, Hamilton, Secretary of Treasury, he planned to bundle the state and federal war debts to Europe and pay off the entire 80 million by way of the federal government doing this. Now, the antis were against this. Antis is also one of the slang terms the Federalists had for the anti-Federalists, primarily the Virginians and the other southern, you know, states representatives. Um, and Madison wants discrimination between the two types of debts because Virginia, for example, had already started on its own paying its own debts back to France and Holland and Spain and Denmark and whoever else in Europe they had borrowed money from during the war years. But some of the other states had not. So this was part of the problem with with the financial and the economic and the commercial stagnation. And so this is why Hamilton thought, no, we need to bundle it all together. The 80 million was a combination of the federal debt, or I should say, the debt created by the Constitution, the Congress, the Warriors Congress, and and then the states on their own. So he felt it would be better it was taken over. So Ames delivers a very elegant speech that shreds Madison's arguments and brings forward what the real priorities should be, and that they will get to solving these details of who has paid what up to this point. But Ames still suffers a defeat here. He's unable to turn enough antis to vote for this assumption. And one writer who observed him says the darling project of Alexander Hamilton and Fisher Ames was slaughtered in the House of Representatives. So Hamilton realized what the problem was, and he realized that the antis they wanted a concession. They wanted to get the capital moved to the Potomac in exchange for the votes. They didn't want it to be in New England. They wanted it to be in Virginia, where they felt that they would then, therefore, have more power and prestige over the federal government. So that's what he gets them. So they come up with a compromise that it'll move to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, for 10 years, and then ultimately it'll move to the Potomac, where it is today. And also in 1790, Ames has now been in for 2 years since his first election, and he's got to run for reelection again at the October 1790 mark, and he's reelected. The next year, he fights for Hamilton's financial plan, and this was about his idea to establish a national bank, which was based on the Bank of England. And Ames again is in full support. Um, now, from this fight, several constitutional questions arise over what are often termed express powers and implied powers that you see in the Constitution. The antis say there's nothing in the Constitution that allows for a national bank. So that's true if you read it like what is expressed. There is nothing expressly said about a national bank. But Ames, from the Federalist viewpoint, has an answer to this. He says, yes, there is. Article 1, Section 8 allows for the Congress to make law, it means to pass bills. Now, of course, they have to be signed into law by the executive, but that's what the Constitution empowers the House of Representatives to do. Well, the whole Congress, really. And so Hamilton follows Ames's logic and convinces Washington to sign this bill when it passes because the Federalists are in the majority. And the federal bank, becomes a reality in 1791. So in this battle, Ames now becomes quite famous as an orator. Here's one of the quotes about him from a friend, Josiah Quincy. The brilliant conversations of Ames, so full of imagery, drawing smiles to illustrate the topics of his discourse from everything about him. I never heard anything quite like it. Quincy said. So this would be a good point to say a few things about what the founders thought about democracy. Because in our world, we're constantly told and educated in the public school system and by media and various forms of media that we are a democracy. But that's not really true. And what the founders said was essentially anti-democracy. I mean, literally, they were against it. Here are the first three bullets give you a few examples of what the republic that they created was like, and that we don't really follow anymore at all. Uh, when they first seated the government, only property owners could vote for the representatives in the state houses and the House of Representatives. So that means probably more than 95% of white men could not vote. They weren't qualified because they weren't property owners of the right amount that that the uh, that the laws of the time said. Senators, they were elected in the state house by the members of the state houses, and they were supposed to represent the states, not the people. That's why there is equal suffrage, two senators for each state. Public, the people, they didn't vote for senators, not directly, only through their elected representatives in the state houses. President also not elected by the people directly. The president was elected by the Electoral College, which of course is another body that gathers every 4 years when there needs to be a presidential election, and they're elected on the same principle. It is the educated, the well-informed property owners who vote for who will be sit on the electoral college that will gather in a particular year to vote for a president. So these kinds of things are probably anathema to people who consider themselves democratic today, or what what a democracy is supposed to look like. Uh, these are not at all democratic in that way of thinking. So here are a couple of quotes. Ames has quite a few throughout all of his letters and his essays. Here's one from early on in 1788. He says, "A democracy is a volcano which conceals the fiery materials of its own destruction." Another one, "The known propensity of a democracy is to licentiousness, which the ambitious call and the ignorant believe to be liberty." He says this in 1805. Next year, "In democracies, prejudices are not only subvert everything that is sacred, but disfigure everything that is decent." Same year in 1806, he says, "Our disease is democracy." Uh, Another one, another like-minded man, John Adams. There's one quote from him where he's talking about, men of property. Now, this goes back to the first bullet comment. He says about men of no property, too little acquainted with public affairs to form the right judgment. So, so these kinds of ideas, these kinds of thoughts about democracy may not be popular or sit well with people today, but they had their reasons for why uh, they thought these things. I mean, number one, um, not everybody could read, so therefore not everybody was educated. That was a major concern. Now we have almost most all people are educated to some degree, at least to the point that they could read. So that, of course, would be a reason for more democracy as opposed to less democracy in our way of thinking in our time period. But that wasn't the world then, and that's just one example of it. So to them, pure democracy was understood as very corrupting. But in a republic, it was an arrangement that contained democratic principles enough through the separation of powers and meritocracy, qualifications to vote, and the selection of certain offices in government by the representatives only, not the people directly. I'll also just give you a quick sample from the book about a discussion between Fisher Ames and a Federalist man who was a judge at the time when they were talking about some of this. And Ames, this is a fellow named Judge Sumner. It's dated March 9, 1789. It was a conversation of the two in the front yard in Roxbury where the judge was. Mr. Ames was passing through from Dedham, and he stopped to give the judge a passing word. He says to him, "What's the news in Boston this morning, Judge?" said he. Just then, Monsieur's a neighbor and attached to the Tory party as he walked by the cart, inquired of the judge what he gave a pound of butter, who answered, "Ninepence a pound for butter." "Ninepence a pound for butter?" Two exclamation points, repeating the words. It did not used to be so in King George's day. "Ninepence for sixpence. This is your new government, is it? Ninepence a pound for butter. It won't last. At least I fear it won't." The judge, who always took the bright side of things, answered, "I do not fear it. The machinery is complex, but it is new. Let us see how it works. Let us give it a fair trial, Mr. Ames." Later, Ames stopped in again. The following conversation occurred. "Well, Judge, what do you think of it now? Why had anyone taken place? Have you not heard the doings in Roxbury town meeting yesterday? It is in the morning papers." "I have not seen the papers," said the judge. "What did they do?" "Well, it is your own town, and surely you don't want a Dedham man to tell you what has done in Roxbury town meeting. Will you be sorry to hear, Judge, that your Constitution had given way in the point of your greatest security after a long debate?" said Mr. Ames. "Not unpremeditatedly. The town decided that a man has an estate of value of £60 if he's able to earn that sum within 1 year." "What?" answered the judge. "Without having a freehold estate or having in possession any personal property of that value?" "No property at all, as I understand it, Judge. A carpenter who owns his tools, but nothing else, and who was able to work for his living, was admitted voting for the representatives to the county court, and General Heath let the majority. You see how it works? What do you think of it now, Judge?" "Why," says the judge, "that construction never entered any man's mind. It amounts almost to universal suffrage. It never will prevail. But if it does, Brother Ames, I must say that my confidence in it is very much diminished." This is an example of where the whole idea to this generation of early Americans, of everybody voting, was a bad idea, that you had to have qualifications to vote. And that, of course, has gone by the wayside a long time ago in the United States. So on to 1792. The dynamic that you start to see is that these political parties now start to crystallize, and a military event affects the politics because of this crystallization. In 1792, the anti-federalists, or known as the antis, they begin to formally call themselves the Republicans. And as I said, Ames sensed now an ever stronger allegiance to states emerging in these Southern Republicans, more so than their allegiance to the federal union. And what happens in this year is militarily is the defeat of General St. Clair out on the Wabash in Ohio. Now he had been sent out there to quell the Miami Indians, but he doesn't do a very good job of leading this makeshift force. 800 men are killed, 260 wounded, which is 3 times the casualties of the Little Bighorn losses in almost 100 years in the future in 1876. So there's going to be a congressional inquiry. The Republicans demand it, and Ames can see that the Republicans want to use this to impugn the Washington administration. And he sees now politics is really starting to come into play here now, a few years after the founding. He sees it as a distraction, an intentional distraction to slow the Federalists' agenda. Now, on a personal note, also in 1792, Fisher Ames is married. He had been courting a girl in Springfield, Massachusetts, the previous year in 1791. Her name was Frances Worthington, and they got married on July the 15th of 1792. They will have 7 children together, 6 boys and 1 girl. Um, so I'm not going to go into too much detail of these children. Um, I've already mentioned Seth Ames, um, a brother of Fisher Ames, Seth Ames, who died, during the war. So obviously he's going to have one of his boys named for that child, for that brother, and that child grows to be successful. Um, Nathaniel is the second one is named after his father. Um, Now, the one girl, Hannah Ames, she died unfortunately at a young age in 1829. She was never married. And now, the one, though, that I will say a few things about is the last one, Richard Howard Ames, born in 1807. And so he was about a year old when Fisher Ames died the next year in 1808. And in my research, I could never find anything about him. I had, as I'm going along, researching and writing, I'm looking at cemetery websites in New England, thinking that that's where he must have been, like his other siblings, but I never came up with anything. And then just by chance, I came up with looking at a census in Illinois for another reason, not research for this book, and saw the name Richard Howard Ames out near Peoria, Illinois, on the river there, and it was him. And then I was able to dig a little deeper and found out that he had moved west, obviously. He was something of a pioneer son. He got as far as Dayton on the old National Road for a while, and there he met a girl, married her there, uh, and moved further on into Illinois. They had a son named Fisher Ames II, so there was Fisher Ames II, born in 1834. And I did go to look for where he was buried. I found the cemetery uh, in outside of Bloomington, Illinois. And you can see the route that I drove from where I was at the time and where it is off of one of the highways in proximity to the town of Bloomington. Here's the gate for the cemetery. I circled Richard Howard Ames's grave there. Died in 1886. Here is more of his family around him. Uh, there's his grave close up. You can see it's quite worn now. It's difficult even to read. And here's to the right there is Fisher Ames II, born in 1834. He died in 1906. And here are some pictures of some of the other family members. So it was an interesting investigation to finally find what happened to what his the baby boy, that of course he knew the least, had done with his life, which is interesting. So back to Fisher Ames and where he lived. This is another interesting find. It took me almost the full 10 years to also run into this drawing in an obscure book, almost by chance. It was drawn by a British diplomat who had been over here traveling in the year 1825 after Ames was gone. But he went through Dedham because Fisher Ames was still famous in 1825, and he wanted to see the house, and he drew a picture of it. So as far as I know, this is the only drawing of the Fisher Ames house that exists anywhere, unless there's another one in some other obscure book. But this is it, and I'm glad I found it. So back to the business of the government. 1793, Ames begins to think there is division in the Union, And other people say the same thing. Is it going to come apart? Now, Washington's reelected by the Electoral College, and Ames stands again for reelection for his third term. In November now of 1792, he defeats a man in Boston named Dr. Benjamin Austin. And here are the numbers that give you an idea of how many qualified white men could vote in his area at the time. And Thomas Jefferson, who was really the leader of the Republican Party, he's the one who changed the name from Anti-Federalist to Republican Party the year before. He's paying attention to Ames, and he wants to get rid of Fisher Ames at the ballot box. Here he says, Fisher Ames, the colossus of the monocrats and the papermen, will either be left out or hard run, he predicts just before the election. Of course, Thomas Jefferson was wrong. Ames defeated Mr. Austin. Uh, and Ames writes of Jefferson that year. He says, well, he doesn't say but he says, Jefferson was a warm advocate of union. But now he's against any schism in our union. He's against everything, he seems. So he was a little frustrated with Jefferson, as Jefferson was frustrated with Fisher Ames. Another quote that Ames says about the Republicans. We have a noisy party who call themselves Republicans, our Jacobin faction. Now, when he says Jacobin, he's referring to the French Revolution, which was in full force by now. And the Jacobins were the radicals who overthrew the monarchy and were out to destroy Christianity and eradicate Christianity in France. And then the whole revolution became this revolving door of leaders who were part of what was known as the Directory in Paris, and they were constantly cutting each other's heads off, and there was nothing but anarchy all the time, it seemed. And so, he says here, Ames is advised to make herself not only the ape but the dupe of France. What he's talking about is if the Republicans have their way, in Ames's opinion. He says, we may look to France and see what it has done, talking about the problems and the horror of the French Revolution. So what goes on in the French Revolution prompts President Washington to take a very strict road of neutrality. Um, and he pursues, peace in every way that he possibly can, knowing that the United States is still fledgling, that it still has economic problems, that it doesn't have any real military strength to speak of, and it cannot stand against England or France if they came over here again with a larger army than they had tried to subdue the colonies with the first time around, because that's probably what they would do in the view of President Washington by the late the mid 1780s. Now, Jefferson had been President Washington's Secretary of State, but obviously he was of the opposite party, so there were problems there. He couldn't get along with Alexander Hamilton. They practically hated each other, and he was little by little undermining the Washington uh, agenda and his administration. And he became almost sympathetic, if not in league, with this citizen Genet, who the French had sent over as their minister, who was trying to get the United States embroiled in a quasi-war on the sea, poaching British shipping using American ships paid for by this citizen Genet. So, and I won't go into all of the details of the Genet affair, but in the end, Jefferson was colluding with this man, and Washington found out about it, and so you know Jefferson had to leave. Before he left, he wrote a final report that arguing that the United States was an economic dependent of Britain, and of course the Republicans were anti-Britain; they were pro-France, and the Federalists were pro-Britain and anti-France in this time period. He said so it was because of Britain's discriminatory trade regulations. Now, there was some truth to that. They did discriminate against American shipping, but that was also because we were overly sympathetic to the French Revolution in their opinion. So that's why, what was going on in Europe in the French Revolution at the time, the war between Britain and France loomed large in American politics by this year, by 1794. So with Jefferson out at Secretary of State and having had been the lead of the not the GOP but the Republican Party at the time, Madison took over as their leader, and he pressed the economic and trade retaliations against Britain from his role in the House of Representatives. Of course, they were still the minority at the time. The Federalists were still the majority in both houses, and they had the president. Ames was the leader by now of the Federalist effort to defeat uh, Republican policies that they thought were harmful to trade and would prevent, anything he would do anything he could to prevent conflict with Britain. And he was successful. He stalled many of Madison's resolutions that year. So 1794 was overall a year of Federalist victories. But it would also portend some losses in the future. Alexander Hamilton signaled that he was resigning as treasurer January 31st the next year in 1795. But he had felt that he had accomplished his plan. But the Federalists needed a party boss, so there was apprehension there. Into the new year, Washington wants to try and solve the problems with Britain and once and for all get our commerce back on track. And this would come with, he thought, fixing the problems of neither side really adhering to the peace treaty of 1783. I don't have time to go into all the details of what they were not doing, but I will say a few of what they are as I explain this. But uh, Washington selects John Jay to go over there and work with his counterpart, Lord Grenville, in London, and uh, and he works and he is successful in getting a treaty known as the Treaty of Amity, Commerce, and Navigation by November of 1794. He brings it back to the United States. He hands it to the Senate. Of course, it's their job to ratify treaties, and they do in 1795, the Federalists being the majority, and then Washington signs it in 1795. But the Republicans hated it. They saw it as a complete capitulation. And Ames said, the success of the Jay Treaty is going to secure peace abroad he means with Britain, but it'll kindle war at home with the Republicans, is who he means. And Congress comes back on December 7th, 1795. Uh, but Ames, for the first time, is not present. He's in Dedham. He fell ill, so this is the first time he's late. And the Federalists are going to need him because the Republicans have now decided in the House that they're going to hold up the appropriation for the treaty. They're going to make resolutions against it, and this huge legislative battle begins that would last well into the next year in 1796 till April the 30th. So here are the provisions of this treaty. Um, America does gain access to the British ports and their markets because some of the British ports they closed some of them to American shipping, which in retaliation for supporting France. But British merchants now they're able to bring lawsuits against private debts owed from before the war period. And they were supposed to be able to do this in 1783, but we were not adhering to that. And of note, there I have at the bottom, some of the colonists, owed debts to the merchants, banks, and other lenders in Britain, and were often, the loudest ones who had been stoking for rebellion in 1775. And part of their personal motivation for this was to avoid paying their debts. This is something that the British made clear many times during the war and after the war. So, and this is a truth that we don't like to admit, I suppose, in our own uh, historiography about this episode. Jefferson, he was one of these men. So now he was hauled into court a couple of times and had to pay, and he was not good with finances, so this was particularly painful for him. American slave owners, they wanted compensation from the British for the slaves that the British had confiscated in the war. And the British said, no, we're not going to pay for that. So that was totally dropped. And Jay had to go along with it. And so, this irritated the slave owners who had been waiting to be paid for their financial losses now for a long time. And they got nothing. And then also there was a provision where the British had to compensate the U.S. for damages sustained by the detention of the Northwest Territory posts. Another violation of the 1783 treaty, but that was dropped, and they didn't have to pay that either. So these things that the British got out of, the Republicans hated. So they were going to hold it up and not pay for the financial parts of the treaty. Um, so Ames, who's still sick, now there are a lot of debates going on in the Congress. They're battling back and forth over this. The Federalists are waiting for him to come back, and Ames is still sick. He travels to Philadelphia in February of 1796. Here's another quote that Jefferson writes sarcastically to one of the Republicans, Virginia Republican Giles. He says, "Oh, I congratulate you on the arrival of Mr. Ames." Well, that's supposed to mean like this is not a good development because we all know what he's capable of doing. So, well, anyway, in March, the Republicans begin with their various tactics. They first start with a demand that the president lay before them his instructions to Jay about what he was supposed to do over in Britain during his negotiations, which was totally preposterous because this is not the lane, this is not the legislative branch's lane to get into the executive branch's work on dealing with other nations. Washington slams them down hard and says, no, you're not going to see any of my documents. It's none of your business. The House does not get into my business, he says. So that fails. Next, they start lengthy debates about the separation of powers, and then the Federalists prevail with those because they were essentially, the Republicans were essentially arguing against the Constitution, and that was a hopeless argument. And then they say the third thing was that the Republicans argued that the treaty was essentially coerced. Now, there was some truth to this. Of course, a nation with a small navy is now negotiating with one that had the world's largest, and of course, large land army. So, that's part of the reason why these concessions had to be made. And the other one was to get access to their ports and sell goods. So, but uh, after all this, one of the Republicans, a Marylander by the name of Samuel Smith, he broke ranks and he said he would vote for the treaty to restore the harmony in the House of Representatives. So there it was. The Federalists see that there's a there's a break in the Republicans' phalanx. So it's this point the Federalists start to become um, encouraged that we're gonna win this debate, and Washington hopes that Ames is now able to come onto the field and deliver the coup de grace. So, and it happens. April the 28th, Ames is ready. He feels well enough, and he kind of sneaks into the chamber. Nobody notices it. There was another congressman making another speech that morning. Nobody was paying attention really. And then Ames signals that he would like to talk, and everybody starts to perk up. And all these people come in from out on the street because they want to see this great, they know what type of orator Fisher Ames is, and they want to see him in action for this huge battle that's been going on in the House of Representatives for so many months. And he starts with his words, shall we break the treaty? The question is here whether the treaty be really so very fatal as to oblige the nation to break its faith. The treaty is the promise of a nation. A popular government will not proceed more arbitrarily as it is freer, nor with less shame or scruple in proportion as it is better morals. So these are the kinds of themes that Ames starts to bring out and try to point out to impress upon the Republicans that we have to keep our word. We have made a treaty. We have obligations. It is not the job of the House of the Representatives to argue and debate over foreign policy. We have an executive branch that handles foreign policy. We have a Senate that approves a treaty. It's not our lane. Our duty is in funding the provisions of what the other two entities come up with. And he speaks for an hour and a half, addressing every aspect of the Republicans' fears that he can think of, and what the consequences would be if the House fails in its duty to support the president and the Senate. And so, in the end, he's successful, and he turns 9 Republicans and wins the debate and gets the appropriation. So this is a huge swan song moment for Fisher Ames's career. This is the first major speech that's published in pamphlet form that's disseminated throughout the United States. Uh, the Federalists send it to their minister in Britain, which is Christopher Gore, and he gives it to the famous uh, parliamentarian Edmund Burke, who's often seen as a equal to Fisher Ames, or Ames seemed as an equal to Edmund Burke. Here's what Christopher Gore says about it. Once it's over in England, it's universally admired. It does honor to our country and is read with great avidity by men of genius and taste. And here's an interesting piece of research I found in my efforts from a man named George S. Boatwell. He was the first commissioner of the Internal Revenue after the American Civil War. He worked for Lincoln as a secretary also. He said he recalled that Lincoln spoke especially of Ames's Jay Treaty speech, often reciting it from memory in his office. So apparently, he probably bought the 1854 set of letters and speeches that Seth Ames published in 1854, being the year that the new GOP was formed. And Lincoln, of course, was essentially the political leader of that party. And really, one can say that, and I say this throughout my book, that the GOP of 1854 were something of neo-federalists of earlier. Not exactly the same, but there were a number. They were for certain, more centralized roles, like the Federalists were, of Washington and Ames and Hamilton's time. So when the session concluded in May of 1796, Ames decided that he was going to have to end his congressional career because of the health problems that he had. Now, I didn't spend much time in this presentation talking about his health, but it was, it's laced throughout the book, and it was the one thing that started to diminish his abilities as you get into the mid and late 1790s. But after this speech, George Washington is so thrilled with what Ames had done for him. He invites him over to dinner, and I can only imagine that this must have been maybe the greatest night of Fisher Ames's life, having a chance to be one-on-one uh, and have a meal and conversation with one of the men he admired the most in his life, President George Washington. So that was a good break for him. But after that, Hamilton was out of office. He'd already left, and Washington and Ames were leaving. So this is the time when the Federalists begin to decline. Uh, Fisher Ames's friend over in London, Christopher Gore, writes a letter to Ames dismayed. He says, "When are you absent? When you are absent, who's going to play your part in the House?" John Adams, he's going to be elected president, but as a Federalist, but he's barely elected in 1796 by only 3 more electors than the Republican Thomas Jefferson, which results in Jefferson becoming the vice president, who's of the completely opposite parties. And this is a flaw in the Constitution, and they'll solve that with the 12th Amendment. But for this particular election, that's what happens. This dynamic occurs. So Ames writes to Alexander Hamilton of how the work of the Congress is just more and more difficult all the time. because of the politics. Our proceedings smell of anarchy. We rest our hopes on foolish, fanatical grounds. So, Ames's final actions in 1797, before he leaves, was to debate several Republicans who tried to stop an appropriation for the frigates, the Constitution, and the Constellation. And he's successful. And so, of note, all his career, Ames wanted an adequate army, force structure of regulars, and also a large enough navy. That was common with all of the Federalists. So now I'm going to run through a couple of years at a time as we're getting close to finishing here. The the Jay Treaty and other trade issues triggered this quasi-war on the seas with France. And Adams tried to appoint Ames as a commissioner to negotiate a treaty with the Cherokee Indians in Tennessee, but Ames declined because his health resulted in him not being able to do that. So instead, Ames would be on the sideline. He would just offer advice on matters from Dedham and through writing his essays. In 1798, the Federalists passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which is to suppress opposition to President John Adams, which ultimately discredits them. It's essentially unconstitutional. Certainly the part about no free speech, really. Um, and you, the Republican Jefferson and Madison penned the Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions, which strengthen state sovereignty. And now they're not really laws, but they're, some people believe they are. But the idea is that they become a doctrine of state is superior over the federal union. And of course, this will continue on in the South, even when they change their name from the party that dominates the South changed their name from Republican to Democrat, and they believe that the doctrine of state is superior to union. That'll go on for decades. But by 1798, some of the Republicans are threatening secession, and that is because of how they felt that the Federalists were now becoming tyrannical in some of these things, such as the Alien and Sedition Act. Now, and then of course President Washington passes away in 1799, who was the patriarch, as it were, not necessarily the leader of the Federalists, but the great head of the Federalists and founder of the father of the nation. So in these years after the turn of the century, as the Republican Party is rising, Fisher Ames is going to try and um, influence efforts from the sideline by writing essays and writing for a paper. Um, and here's one of his first ones in 1801 called the Falkland One Essay. And this is an interesting observation. The change in the American administration is an event to create surprise and alarm. He writes on February the 3rd, 1801. Newspapers are an overmatch for any government, and the Jacobins owe their triumph to the unceasing use of this engine, not so much to skill in the use of it, but by repetition, he says. And throughout 1801, he wrote for the Palladium, the paper, and he covered American political principles, the rise of Napoleon. He feared Napoleon, at least for a number of years. What he thought Napoleon represented. Talked about different examples of republic going back to the ancient world. Such themes as Roman devotion and spirit. And here are a couple of the titles of some of his essays in those particular years. So as the Republicans now gain seats in the House and the Senate, and of course they have the executive branch with Thomas Jefferson as president, the pendulum of power has swung the other way. The Federalists are now the party out of power. And this becomes a harbinger of political doom, along with Jefferson as president, this majority. And then, of course, the big one is the arrival of the purchase of Louisiana, which is unwanted by the Federalists. One of Fisher Ames's other friends, Timothy Pickering, who's described as possessing a genius for agitation and intrigue. He talks openly of secession since the Federalist government had fallen into the hands of the infidel, the anti-commercial, anti-New England Southerners, he said. Pickering stated of this dynamic, he said his natural order is toward Salem, his town, Massachusetts, his state, New England, his region, and then the Union at large. So you can see here in this example of this secession movement leader, here you have a Federalist who is now retreated into states' rights, thinking it's time to get out of the Union. So Pickering and his cabal continue to work on this and plan for how to secede, how to bring New England out of the Union and form their own confederacy and then deal directly with England in trade. That's the initial plan. Now Fisher Ames and Alexander, they are not secessionists. They are against Pickering's secession idea, particularly when these plotters approach Aaron Burr to join them. Aaron Burr's a Republican. He is Jefferson's vice president, but they can't stand each other. And Aaron Burr, is somebody that just about men of both sides see as a very vain and self-serving individual and a dangerous man. Now, and Aaron Burr had a plot later that he to bring parts of the Western territories out and create his own nation. Along the lines that some people thought he thought like Napoleon. He was bold like Napoleon. So anyway, many in government thought he was a dangerous man uh, and, uh, and viewed him that way. So when Hamilton found out, he went after Burr, who was then going to run for New York governor's election. And the New York governor, these secessionists, these New England secessionists, were trying to make a deal with Burr where they would get Federalists to vote for him in New York so he would win, and then he would join them and bring New York out of the Union into the New England Confederacy, and maybe even bring New Jersey with him since he had ties and influence over there. Well, anyway, uh, Hamilton's um, involvement in campaigning against Burr led to Burr's defeat in this election. And this, of course, incensed Burr, and this led to the duel where Burr shoots Alexander Hamilton and kills him. But back to Ames, as the secession movement would, its initial rearing of its head would simmer down, uh, in 1803, 1804, 1805 and 6, but it would culminate again in 1807 with another uh, tariff that the Republicans would win against the British, which would hurt New England, and they don't like that. And finally, after Ames is gone, there would be the first secession convention held in 1814 in Hartford, um, and they would not follow through with it. But as you can see, that this secession movement was not just words. There was action that was going on, and it was serious for a while. But Ames is no longer included in any of this because the secessionists know that he's against it. And so Ames does not talk with his friends who were for it. He remains friends with them, of course, but this topic he will not agree with them on. He does write in some of his essays about Confederacy. He rebukes it. One example he gives is the German Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was an anarchy of republics, which, because it was easy to divide, it cost no trouble to subdue or keep it in subjugation. So it's just another example of why Ames was a Federalist minded man and not a Confederacy minded man. In this year, his health continues to decline into 1808, and he became housebound. He wrote often to his oldest son, John Worthington, who's at a boarding school out in western Massachusetts. He loved to give him advice in every letter about school academics, about how to be an orator, about Christianity. Uh, Charged John to read your Bible often, always study it on Sundays, he said. But finally, in June, Ames writes to one of his friends, I am sick. And he starts writing his last will and testament because he knows that the end is near. By the end of June in 1808, Ames is bedridden. He writes, as weakness becomes him neither as a Christian or as a man to repine at an approaching event which there was no possibility of avoiding or escaping, that holding fast to the Christian faith, he should die with resignation to his Maker's will. He wrote to his friend Thomas Dwight as he went back and forth from lucidity to deliriousness. The repertory paper reported on July the 3rd, 1808, our beloved friend seems to be sinking fast. That mind, once luminous as a sunbeam, is now darkened, confused, and broken. And the next day, early in the morning, on July the 4th, on the nation's 32nd birthday, Fisher Ames died in his home at 4 a.m., surrounded by his family, except for the one son, Worthington, who wasn't able to make it back home on time. So Ames was buried in Dedham, Massachusetts, and he remains there today. There's his grave there to the right. Um, there is extensive research about the funerals that there were for Ames and all of the people that came to it and all of the things that the Federalists did for Fisher Ames. I'll not cover those here today, but I will mention one comment. It was very simple by, again, very close friends of his, an Honorable Isaac P. Davis, uh, who said simply of Ames, everybody loved him. And in a way, that's true. Even the Republicans admired him. Not a Republican anywhere ever really said anything about his character, not even Thomas Jefferson, really. I mean, he didn't agree with him, but with Ames, but he never impugned his integrity and his moral character or his Christian forbearance. So with that, I will end my discussion here on Fisher Ames. And again, the book was published this particular year in 2025 and can be found on the Liberty Hill uh, publishing website and also on other major websites such as Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And I thank you for listening. Good night.